Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Blue Stack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine for environmental matters on the island of Ireland. We're here today in a series of our conversations on environmental matters. I'm very pleased today to welcome John Sweeny, Professor of Geography at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. We're recording this conversation through the use of Skype, an internet program that allows us to talk and see each other over the internet at no cost. And John, the meeting in Copenhagen in December 2009, which you attended, what was the purpose of that meeting? This was part of the UN Framework Convention and to determine the next step under that convention?
Yes, the United Nations Framework Convention grew out of the Rio Summit way back in the early 1990s, and at the moment it's still the only worldwide legally binding organisation which countries have subscribed to, some of which of course have not subscribed to the Kyoto Protocol, as we know. And as part of that, countries are obliged, for example, to report on their emissions inventory each year. They're required to report on what they've done in terms of projecting impacts, but they're also required to meet and to put together plans for how they're going to try and meet some of the objectives of that particular framework convention. And one of the objectives of that convention was to do what they could in their power to avoid what was termed dangerous climate change. And dangerous climate change has only been defined by one group of countries, namely the European Union countries, as a global temperature rise above pre-industrial levels of 2 degrees centigrade. But each year, the participants, the parties to the United Nations Framework meeting, have what's called a Conference of the Parties, a COP meeting for short. And Copenhagen was the 15th such COP meeting that took place. It was held at a very crucial time because it was held at a time when it was necessary to plan further ahead than the Kyoto Protocol, which, despite having a lifetime which extended from 1997, finished effectively in 2012. And so it was necessary to look further than 2012 at this particular time. Copenhagen was really built up as the, if you like, the critical moment for the world, the critical moment for the countries of the world to reach this all-encompassing agreement. It was built up in recognition also of the fact that we were running out of time, that unless we managed to start showing signs of controlling global emissions and showing a peak being reached, which was going to be not exceeded sometime in the next decade, then the indications were that we would be eliminating a lot of the possibilities that we would otherwise have for avoiding that 2-degree threshold of dangerous climate change. And so for a lot of reasons, if you like, Copenhagen, it had a new US president to come to it. It had a lot of things going for it which were absent in previous meetings. And for all of those reasons, it was being held as the defining moment, in a way, for the global community to receive.
Yeah, John, the expectations were indeed quite high, and the Conference of the Parties, or the COP meeting, as you call it, I now hear it described as the COP-out at Copenhagen, and that there was very little produced. What was the product from that Copenhagen meeting? There's the Copenhagen Accord, and I wonder if you could just tell us what that was and how that came about.
Well, the meeting was effectively deadlocked for the best part of 2 weeks. The meeting had broken up into a number of different power groups, if you like, and perhaps the most vociferous and the most, I suppose, active group was the group of 77 plus China, which comprised the developing countries of the world, plus China, which kind of falls also into that developing country status. And ranged against them, and maybe against is not a right word, but ranged on the other side were the developed countries of the world. So here you had 2 power blocks, one of which was the cause of the problem historically, and which bore historic responsibility for solving the problem, therefore, namely ourselves, the developed countries of the world, who have achieved wealth and achieved material gain by effectively burning fossil fuels without any controls being imposed upon us. And on the other hand, you have the developing countries, where a lower level of economic development was evident, and the effort really was being made considerably to try and attain economic development almost at any cost. And so they were quite naturally loath to hamstring their own economic development prospects by indulging in controls which would be, they would see, damaging to their own economy. China, of course, falls into some extent to both of those, but the crux of the problem is that the developing countries, and in particular China, will account for the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions over the next few decades. And so despite whatever the developed countries do in terms of controls, it will not be enough to address the problem, and this means that we have to have some kind of an agreement among the developing countries. But what I saw over the 2 weeks was effectively largely a deadlock between those two groups. Neither would budge. The developing countries were really looking for reparations, effectively, from the developed world without strings attached. And the developed world, naturally enough, felt that, giving money to some, at least, of the developing countries without any strings attached might not be the most efficient way of tackling anything, far less climate change. So you had this standoff, and the standoff continued. It has been continuing for many years, I suppose, but it really became highlighted. A bid of about 100 billion euros was what the EU reckoned was necessary to adapt the third world, developing world economies to cope with climate change. So the stakes were very high. The actual amount of money on the table was more like $100 billion, which was a rather lesser amount. But in the end, the agreement was not reached, and the agreement was not reached largely because of the issue of verification. Nobody was willing to part with money without verification in the developed world, and in the developing world, verification was seen almost as a form of neocolonialism, where Big Brother would be looking at how the money was being spent and questioning the way money was being spent. So it hit a rock at that point. And I suppose the last couple of days, with the arrival of the various leaders, there was hope that the logjam could be broken. It wasn't. The various world leaders did not offer anything new from their established negotiating position. And so what we had was an attempt to salvage something by a group of very large developing countries, led by China, comprising India, South Africa, and Brazil, and the United States, if you like, as a representative of the developed countries, effectively doing a deal behind closed doors. In both cases, those groups of countries were not keen on having anything legally binding. They wanted a voluntary deal with no particular legal sanctions if things weren't achieved. And so this was anathema to some other countries, such as the European Union, who had very elaborate procedures for verification and for, if you like, checking up how people are getting on and whether they're doing it right. But this deal was hatched on the last day of the conference, behind closed doors, and then presented to the plenary session. And the plenary session looked at it and decided it wasn't something that they could take as the guts of a deal for a global agreement. So they simply noted that a deal had been done between some countries and moved on. Now, the deal itself is not really worth elaborating on because it's full of pious aspirations. It does, for example, say that the countries commit themselves to doing everything in their power to keep global temperature from rising above 2 degrees, but it doesn't say how they're going to do that. It doesn't say when they're going to envisage their peak emissions will occur. It doesn't say whether they will have any verification. It's simply a voluntary agreement. It does commit them to perhaps hardening up some aspects of that agreement by the end of January 2010. But one has to be rather suspicious of this, and it looks, for most people at the conference, it looked rather as if it was a face-saving gesture designed to allow those world leaders to go home and claim they had something tangible as a product to present to their electorate.